Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. I am your host, Q, coming to you yet again from my mother's basement, and I am joined by my co-host, P. How goes it, P?
Fucking amazing. Had a great weekend. Restored a griddle that I pulled off the street. Freed some lobsters from their unfair imprisonment in an aquarium tank. You know, just all day in life. Let's dive into it. What do we got today? Who's our guest?
Our guest today is self-proclaimed socialist libertarian Ben de Waal. We're going to dive into just the political space as we know it. And surprise, surprise, I don't actually agree with him. So this will be a really fun conversation. And then, of course, we'll kick things off in just a moment with news and notes. Before we do that, I do want to remind everyone that tickets for Bitcoin Amsterdam are on sale now. Use promo code BMLive to get 10% off. Ticket prices went up last Friday. You are warned. I don't want to hear you crying about it. This is going to be the biggest party in all of Europe in just a little more than 2 weeks now. Lock in your tickets now before ticket prices go up. Let's dive into the news and notes. It looks like the ECB once again just touting how much they love a central bank digital currency. They are exploring distributed ledger technology for interbank settlements, a solution that builds on existing interbank settlement infrastructure. Instead of one based entirely on distributed ledger technology, it can be implemented more rapidly, according to the ECB executive board member, Fabio Panetta. Yeah, dude. Honestly, this reads exactly like that study that everyone is familiar with, that your mom or your parents talked about. Oh, like a glass of red wine every night is good for you. Yeah, and then you realize, oh, it was Big Wine that did that study. Like, you're being told by the central banks, oh, this central bank digital currency. Like, these are the benefits of it. Ignore the millions of freedoms we're going to take away from you. Ignore the security and the oversight risk that you're going to have by using this. It makes our lives more easy, so therefore we're going to do it.
I just love the idea of Big Wine. It absolutely exists, but it's such an interesting thing. Like, you chose that one specifically. Like, Big Wine is here to kill you. Big Wine supports American alcoholism. Fuck Big Wine.
I could have gone the other route, which was when we were told dark chocolate was supposedly healthy for you, and that research was done by Hershey's.
I thought you were going to say Big Chocolate.
No,
it's Big Chocolate.
It's funded
with their shadowy hands and all the chocolate pies, bro.
This like
Big Wine exists, and I choose to believe that they meet in a giant wine bottle somewhere in Hollow Earth. But
now I'm into it.
Yeah.
Now I want to join Big Wine.
It reminds me of that study that we saw a couple months ago where it was like, showing the health of all these different items. And it was like Honey Nut Cheerios. It was like almond peanut M&Ms or almond M&Ms or whatever. It's like, oh, wow, it's very specific with the branding. It's not just like, chocolate or like oats or something like that. Yeah, for sure.
Do you guys have anything more to add right now, or should we save more dunking on the ECB for later?
Yeah, let's save more dunking on the ECB for later. As the title of our episode today suggests, things are getting dicey, my friends. Things are getting dicey. But yeah, let's keep going.
P, can you give us some good news at least from around the world?
Absolutely. Satsback.com is connecting the world via Lightning. In May, Satsback.com connected over 2,800 stores in Spain, Italy, Norway. They are announcing today that they have an additional 2,750 stores in Denmark, Sweden, Czech Republic, and Finland that they are connecting and empowering via Bitcoin. Now, this, again, is not like a major news story. The reason we're highlighting it here is because I like to focus on stories that demonstrate the continued expansion of Bitcoin into traditional financial markets. We love to think about Bitcoin as this thing that kind of like solves all these problems, but the reality is it is significantly better than the existing financial system at things like instant settlement, speed of transaction, and so many other things that stores that don't really care about Bitcoin can immediately grok when you can tell somebody, hey, you can have final settlement on a payment from a person and you don't have to pay the 3 to 4% credit card fees. That's something that like people just get immediately, and they're like, I don't need to know all the details. I want that thing. And so tools like this, companies that are investing in this kind of stuff are always pretty awesome. So
yeah, and the cool thing too about about Bitcoin being a global currency is you don't have to worry about exchange rates. It's all one global payment system. And I know obviously Italy, Spain, all those countries are part of the European Union. But if a country were to break away, it's under the same monetary denomination, so it's much easier, and you don't have to worry about currency, changes and all that. We'll get into that later in the episode.
absolutely.
Chris, I'm looking to spend some cash, but you were telling me that Bitcoin may not be the best value out there. What shitcoin are you going to shill?
You thought Bitcoin was at a discount. Well, Grayscale is at a super discount by comparison. What do I mean by that? More woes for the Grayscale investors at large. As many people know, GBTC, or Grayscale Investment Fund, their Bitcoin fund, you can invest in retirement accounts. So right now, the fund has hit the new low, all-time low for GBTC. It's trading at a 35% discount compared to NAV, or net asset value. So compared to the Bitcoin that's in it, it's at 35% discount by comparison. Obviously, this hits hard people that didn't buy Bitcoin spot, or Bitcoin native, that you bearer instrument that you hold yourself. People that are putting this in investing accounts, Robinhood, IRAs, or 401ks.
And just for a little bit more context, there was a period, including through the last bull market in 2017, where this trust, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, was trading at a significant premium to net asset value, a premium to NAV. And you can go on Google right now and you can look up, if you do GBTC premium to NAV ratio, you'll see the historical chart. But for a long time, it was very difficult, or it was more difficult for entities, institutions, individuals to feel comfortable getting access or getting Bitcoin exposure on their balance sheets. And so everyone was piling into GBTC in the last bull market in 2017. And so there was actually a significant premium. I think at peak, it was like over 100% premium to NAV. So if you wanted to buy the equivalent of one Bitcoin, because people had concerns, or they were stressed out about the idea, or in some cases, regulations prevented them from owning Bitcoin spot as an asset, actually holding their own keys, they would have to buy GBTC. And so if you wanted to buy one Bitcoin equivalent in GBTC, you had to pay 200% of spot. So there was a long period where there was an arbitrage trade there. But as Bitcoin becomes more and more easy for people and organizations and companies to own and hold themselves, the premium continues to plummet. And there are many people, myself included, who hold GBTC in their retirement accounts because it's difficult to sort of, now there's better facilities for using your IRA or things like that, your IRA account to hold Bitcoin directly. But in the past, that was not as easy. So it sucks. And hopefully if an ETF is approved, it will go back to being approximately zero, but nobody fucking knows. So we'll see what happens. Next story.
Cool. I'm going to talk about Dictator Newsom. Chris, I know this says, did he do something right or does something right? There's no way in hell I don't even care. And I'm going to explain why in just a second. So Newsom vetoed a crypto bill, essentially saying that he doesn't want all these insane regulations. There's still some stuff coming through from the federal government that should help dictate how California handles it. He wants he doesn't want this licensing regime to oversee the whole state as they try to adopt Bitcoin and crypto. This is a step in the right direction, and I actually think that Gavin Newsom is learning from the mistakes made by California when they legalized marijuana, how difficult obtaining licenses have been, all this cloudiness around the regulatory framework ahead of whatever federal decisions can or may get made around this thing. First example was marijuana. In this iteration, now we're dealing with just digital assets as a whole. To be honest, I would really just like to see California lean in rather than just sort of skirt around this. There's an opportunity here, and I think Gavin Newsom is sleeping on it. Yeah, by not signing this bill into law, I think the decreased amount of legislation gives the broader cancel me, I dare you, gives the broader crypto industry, I think, the opportunity to continue to grow, at least in this state, which is a promising thing because there are other states that have inhibited its growth. Um, Ultimately, it doesn't matter if this bill got signed into law or not. Bitcoin will continue to operate, whether in this jurisdiction or in others. I would just rather see lawmakers embrace this technology rather than try and like avoid it, which I feel like is the way that I'm interpreting this decision by California.
Can you elaborate a little bit? Is this a situation? Is this kind of a situation like New York, where there was the, there's these Orwellian things you have to have like licenses? Like, what exactly is on the table here?
So the governor said the bill would have cost California a lot of money just to then potentially have the decision reversed. And what they would have essentially done, i.e., like where this money would have gone, is essentially like forcing crypto companies to obtain licenses to then offer their services in the state.
Okay, so basically it's a bit license like in New York, which, by the way, and obviously there is a huge spectrum of ways to do this, but at the end of the day, they're all bullshit. And New York is an interesting case study if you don't know about it, because most or many Bitcoin-focused entities simply cannot operate in New York because they have terrible fees, just like all this regulation and stuff that actually just blocks the most innovative companies who are in the Bitcoin space from being able to operate there. So it's, I suppose it's whatever the reasons for it. It is positive that Newsom did not sign this. But anytime you hear about these types of things, like, yo, we need to protect the consumers because they are dumb as fuck, you need to basically be like, this is bad news, and it will most likely end in a situation like New York where companies simply can't operate. If you're a citizen of New York, a resident of New York, I should say, there's just a lot of stuff you just don't have access to.
Like for example, New York doesn't have strike.
Yeah, which is crazy because strike is in a lot of different countries, like all over the place. But in New York, they just can't operate because it's just not worth their time to have a bit license and deal with all the bullshit there.
Yeah, it's like I said, ultimately the Bitcoin network itself like won't care. I think it's interesting to see, and I hate to label it like this, but New York being such a blue state, California also being labeled like a blue state, to see both of these states actually take opposite stances. Ultimately, what I think is something else is coming down the pipelines in California. What that is remains to be seen. Even though Gavin Newsom like accidentally tripped over and did the right thing, I'm still kind of thinking, expecting, anticipating that like, if anything, he just like fell into a vast pool of money, and therefore that's what decided or made his decision for him more than anything.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure like FTX was like, I mean, you could sign this thing, but instead, what if
like I'm trying to look up where's Coinbase, because FTX is in the Bahamas.
No, it doesn't matter. They're going to lobby.
Yeah, they're going to lobby the public.
Yeah, they're lobbying everywhere.
Q's just like, after 1,000 wrongs, this one right does not make it. And, they already
fuck no, it doesn't.
By renaming Crypto Arena Staples Center, the Crypto.com.
It's arena. Not Crypto.com Arena. Like, I don't give a fuck. It's Staples Center. It's the house that Kobe built. No one will change that.
Yo, Kobe's legacy has been taken, torn up into little pieces, and then shit on by Crypto.com.
You are dead man.
That's what you're facing right now. Don't look at me. Look, I didn't want this. I was out there with a sign.
You are a dead man walking.
I was out there with a sign with the best of them protesting this because I care about sports ball. And
Chris, mute his mic.
Kobe beef, Bryant.
And,
Done. Let's keep going.
Done with him. All right. Show us the global hash rate, Chris.
Bitcoin mining, not only fundamental process for maintaining the Bitcoin network, obviously, but it's a linkage between Bitcoin and the physical world. So there is some awesome research. It is a little bit outdated, at least for the data that they had, but it's still cool nonetheless. So this is showing the global hash rate, or at least the locations where a lot of the miners are. Obviously, this data was from 2018 of June of 2018 to May of 2019. So it shows a lot of miners still in China at this time. It's showing like obviously the Philippines, Japan, a lot in the US, scatterings in South America and Africa. I'm surprised at how lit up Europe is. Obviously, this is 2018 to 2019. Now with gas prices and electricity prices soaring, I'm assuming a lot of those miners are having to turn off just because they're not profitable, unless you have like even the top end equipment or miners. But yeah, very cool nonetheless, showing the public hash rate. I'm not sure how they found this data because I know P was saying a lot of times you're not broadcasting where you are, or you're using a VPN to kind of obscure your location. But anything else that you guys want to talk about there?
Yeah, you nailed it. It's difficult to know without more details exactly how this data was collected, what it represents specifically. One thing that is important to take into consideration is that most, at least Bitcoin nodes that are running, are even if they are public, they're going to be potentially running through VPNs, through Tor, things like that, and so their specific geographic location is going to be obscured. But it sounds like this is related to miners specifically, so it may be self-reported. We're not sure. Regardless, I think that, and of course, as you said, this is from an earlier period of time. But I think that it's still an interesting visual because whether it is out of date as of today, it still shows that mining hash rate tends to be geographically distributed and attracted to areas where there is favorable regulation and also very low cost power, which is awesome, and it's how we would expect it to operate.
Cool. I'm gonna just quickly. I want to revisit yet again Iran, and just these protests are not over. These uprisings. What I'm gonna continue to call it is a revolution of sorts. The news is slowing down out of there, due in large part because the Iranian government has been slowly shutting down internet servers from time to time. That's why you still receive and see posts and videos coming out of Iran. They're trying to create this doubt around this movement by flipping internet on and off so that people outside of the country hear them call out and say, oh, they've shut down the internet. But then how are these videos getting posted? Well, they shut down the internet for 2 hours, turn it back on for an hour, turn it back off, and so on. We have been in touch with my family out there. That's really all the updates I can provide at this time, but I do want to just say thank you to Bitcoin Magazine for letting us share this story and talk about it, as this is a freedom platform and this is a story and movement about people's freedoms. P, I turn it over to you next.
Absolutely. So there is a story that actually is from several years back, but it is recently bubbled back up through the courts. There was an FBI raid that resulted in $86 million worth of property being seized from 1,400 safe deposit boxes in Beverly Hills. They basically, the reason this is bubbling back up, the new development, is that it appears as though they misled the judge that signed the warrant. So there's newly unsealed court documents that show that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in L.A. Got this warrant by misleading the judge, as I said. The FBI drilled and pried their way into these boxes, and they went through all the public belongings of the people that were there, hundreds of citizens. They took photos of videos of pay stubs, password lists, credit cards, prenuptial agreements, immigration, vaccination records, bank statements, heirlooms, all sorts of shit that they just have no right to be going through. As I said, it's starting to look like they fully misled the judge who signed the warrant. They omitted from the warrant a central part of the FBI's plan, which was permanent confiscation of everything inside the box containing at least $5,000 in cash or goods. And it was really this sort of unprecedented dragnet of scourging all these people who had their assets stored supposedly safely. And there's claims that this was them just trying to seize funds. But regardless, it is a huge, huge overreach. They made these kind of sweeping allegations of criminal activity, which truly don't make any sense. They said things specifically like, they made these sweeping allegations like, they said that it would be irrational for anyone who wasn't a lawbreaker to entrust and store their assets with a private entity rather than a bank, which they claim could better safeguard these assets. So the key takeaway here is the FBI claimed that simply trusting a private party to keep your assets safe was in and of itself indication of wrongdoing. And that is a insane thing to be claiming. So this is now bubbled back up in the courts. We're going to see what happens. They said only those who wish to hide their wealth from the DEA, IRS, or creditors would rent a box anonymously at U.S. private vaults. And as I said, it's just fucking nuts. That is a insane claim to be making, and we need to push back against that type of overreach because it is a very, very slippery slope to, you can't keep your stuff privately. You have to be telling the government exactly what you own, where you own it, and why you own it at all times.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I think even Yella said, aren't banks privately owned too, though? So I think that's pretty funny. But obviously, I guess banks are more willing to partake with the government and stuff like that compared to a private non-banks. The name of the company was called U.S. Private Vaults. So I guess it sounds like it was outside of the banking system itself. They're not a money license or money broker dealer, I guess is the name of it. But yeah, very, very interesting for sure.
I have a really just random funny story from the weekend. Have either of you seen the Will Ferrell movie, The Other Guys?
Yes, great movie.
Okay.
The classic.
It's so funny. If you've never seen it, highly recommend. Also, if anyone from Netflix is watching, the stupidest decision you guys have ever made in your business was to stop allowing us to record the screen, because I tried to record this scene at least 4 times to post on my Twitter, and I never liked the video. But there's a scene where Mark Wahlberg and Will Ferrell's character end up going to the SEC, and the guy that they take all of their evidence to is explaining what does the SEC do and what is the Federal Reserve, and it is comical, truly just comedic masterpiece right here when Mark Wahlberg is like, wait, so you guys just regulate yourselves? This movie came out 12 years ago and they were cracking these jokes, and we're now dealing with the repercussions of this. I don't know. That's all. That just came into my head. Moving on.
There's another thing I want to jump in and talk about, which is this news story broke over the weekend. There's an Australian internet provider, Optus, which exposed customer data via their API of 4.2 million users' passport and driver's license numbers. And this was originally presented as they got hacked, but it has become clearer that actually they simply had an API that didn't have any credentialing or protections over it. So in total, 11.2 million sensitive customer records were compromised. Early Saturday, a person going by the nickname Optus Data published 2 samples of the purported data stolen on a well-known data leak forum. The attacker writes that Optus can prevent the sale of the data to other cybercriminals if it pays $1 million in the Monero cryptocurrency. They said that they have a week to pay. Otherwise, it'll be chopped up and sold in smaller parcels. And it's basically, they wrote that no authentication was needed. This is bad access control. It was all open to the internet for anyone to use. We talk about this a lot on this show, but one of the major problems with, the other key detail here is that in order to get access to the internet, again, Optus internet service provider, you have to KYC yourself in Australia. So they have all this data. They force you to give it to them in order to get access to this thing, which should be a free and open good, which is the internet. And as we talk about, when you allow people, when you give your data to these centralized entities, right? It doesn't even matter whether you trust that specific entity to screw you over or to resell your data or to do something else. It creates this honeypot. So in this case, Optus Data, they just fucked up massively by not even having basic access controls in place. But even if they did, it creates these honeypots that other people, hackers, are incentivized to get access to put vast amounts of money into hacking. And then that's how your data gets exposed. So these companies that collect the data, they just get to say, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. It was an accident. We did a thing, but it wasn't us. But it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter whether you trust them. It doesn't matter whether you're doing the right thing and you're not actually a bad person. Privacy is a human right, and we all need to be fighting vehemently to protect that.
Thank you, sir. Chris, can we roll the tape?
Yeah, we can roll the tape real quick.
And to tee it up, obviously, this is we're going to show the tape that's been going around Twitter of the Italian Prime Minister. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion on who she is, why she matters, or does she at all?
Potrei farne tante altre di queste domande. A monte c'è quella che ci facciamo oggi: perché la famiglia è un nemico? Perché la famiglia fa così paura? C'è una risposta unica per tutte queste domande: perché ci definisce, perché è la nostra identità, perché tutto quello che ci definisce in questo tempo è un nemico, per chi vorrebbe che non avessimo più un'identità e che fossimo solamente schiavi, consumatori perfetti. E allora è sotto attacco l'identità nazionale, è sotto attacco l'identità religiosa, è sotto attacco l'identità di genere, è sotto attacco l'identità familiare. Non devo potermi definire italiana, cristiana, donna, madre, no. Io devo essere cittadino X, genitore 1, genitore 2, devo essere un numero. Perché quando sarò solamente un numero, quando non avrò più un'identità, quando non avrò più radici, beh, allora sarò lo schiavo perfetto in balia della grande speculazione finanziaria, il consumatore perfetto. E questa è la ragione per la quale oggi noi facciamo tanta paura. Questa è la ragione per la quale oggi questo appuntamento fa tanta paura. Perché noi non vogliamo essere dei numeri, noi siamo qui per dire che noi non siamo dei numeri, noi difenderemo il valore della persona umana, di ogni singola persona umana, perché ognuno di noi ha un codice genetico unico e irripetibile. E questo, piaccia o no, ha del sacro. Lo difenderemo Dio, la patria e la famiglia, che fanno tanto schifo a qualcuno. Lo faremo per difendere la nostra libertà, perché noi non saremo mai schiavi e semplici consumatori in balia della speculazione finanziaria. Ecco la nostra missione, ecco perché oggi sono venuta qui. Scriveva Chesterton ormai più di un secolo fa, vediamo se ve lo trovo: fuochi verranno attizzati per dimostrare che 2 più 2 fa 4. Spade verranno sguainate per dimostrare che le foglie sono verdi in estate. Quel tempo è arrivato, signori. Siamo pronti. Grazie.
Chris.
Man.
It was fiery stuff.
Yes.
So, yeah, that was the first female prime minister of Italy. She just finally won the election last night. Her name is Giorgia Meloni. I might add, she was kind of running her campaign on God, country, family. She obviously won on a very populist movement because of everything that was going on in the last few years. And I'd say Italy is a very prideful nation, very much like the United States. It does come with some faults, obviously, in their history. They're not perfect like anyone else. Right now, she's kind of being torn down by the mainstream media over in Italy, that by her becoming prime minister is a risk for women's rights. They're obviously talking about she's very much pro-life. So obviously, people are worried about the right to abortion or the pro-choice people. I will also caveat and say that she said Mussolini was a great dictator, and that she paints him as one of the best leaders of the country in the last, century or so. So why are we talking about a politician? We are very apolitical on the show. I want to hammer home points that Q says all the time that I completely agree with. Grifters are going to grift. And what I mean by that, politicians are the A+, 100% grifters of the world. Obviously she's pushing for very much, it sounds like sovereign individual identity, family, country. It all sounds very great. With that being said, it does not matter. Italy is up to their eyeballs in debt. Over, I think, 700 billion is what we were looking at before Q. And they are not like the U.S. with the might of the U.S. dollar or the ability to even print their own currency. That is obviously delegated to the ECB. So there's basically three outcomes that are going to happen. So obviously people are very happy that she won, or at least she was very populist. She won by a large margin, at least in Italy. But Italy's going to either default on their debt obligations. They're either going to get bailed out by the ECB, and the Germans are going to be very, very pissed because they're stealing their money and their net worth is basically Germany's propping up the whole ECB right now. Italy, Portugal, Spain, and all those various places. Or they will break away from the ECB and they will start printing their own currency and they will deal with their own hyperinflation. At least those are my three outcomes. I guess, is there anything else that you guys want to add, Q and P?
I'd love to just reiterate and hammer home this grifters always grift thing. And I'm gonna read this, and my source is I'm not gonna be able to pronounce it. I think it's the Italian journal. The title of it's Giornale d'Italia, Chris, as our resident Italian, I'm going to assume that means the Italian.
Keep trying. Can you just keep trying to pronounce it in random ways?
Anyways, since February of 2021, Maloney has been a member of the Aspen Institute, an international think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., which includes many financiers, businessmen, and politicians. She also spoke at the 2022 CPAC conference down over in Florida. There we are. I was like, wait, what happened to all of this? I think what you're seeing is populism continue to win in different subsets around the world and different forms of populism. Ultimately, what she says or what she does will not matter in the grand scheme of things, due in large part because of Italy's financial situation. You have Italy as the most indebted country in all of Europe at this present moment in time. We are bearing witness to the dollar milkshake theory play out. I think if you don't already read James Lavish's work, who's been on this show once before, highly recommend. His most recent article from yesterday actually specifically highlighted how the ECB and Italy owe so much money to Germany that it's actually in Germany's best interest to break out and exit the European Union, and explains in great detail why and how Italy is just doomed to fail regardless of whatever policy decisions they make, short of, I don't know, some rich benefactor just coming in and dropping almost $1 trillion in Georgia's lap. Italy will go bankrupt, be defunct, and like the European experiment will have to start over again. I think it is telling, though, that we've seen Italy go through a very tumultuous time in the political space over the last 6 months. You had, it was their prime minister who originally, he stepped down. He was like, we're so screwed. I can't be the one in charge while the country collapses. I don't want that on my resume. So he's like, bye, I made this mess and you guys have to deal with it. And then now this is sort of the response they get. One thing that I'll be interested to see is how she handles the sanctions against Russia. If we start to see her align with Russia for the sake of let's bring in oil, let Italy be this sort of middleman for the rest of Europe, it could be a really interesting opportunity for Italy to save itself. Remains to be seen. I'm not going to buy into the polarization of her character on either end of the spectrum. I'm going to let her sort of actions speak for themselves. But I will say, if you think that Mussolini is the best leader that your country has had in the last 50 years, I got some questions for you, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well said.
On that note, I do want to remind everyone before we cut to a commercial break that if you are not yet subscribed to the print magazine, you should do so now, because the Orange Party issue is on its way soon. You are going to want a copy. It's even bigger and badder than this behemoth of an encyclopedia that we like to call the Bitcoin Magazine. Lock in your subscription today at the Bitcoin Magazine store. Use promo code BMLive to get 10% off. Let's cut to commercial and then we'll be joined by Ben. sticking through those 3 commercial breaks, as Yellow kindly pointed out. Yes, I did also do a commercial for you all. I'm excited to introduce our guest today. He's the VP of Engineering over at Swan. He gives himself a lot of different names. I discovered him off of his episode of What Bitcoin Did, the self-proclaimed libertarian, socialist, anarchist, Ben de Waal. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome to the
thank you
show.
for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You're muted.
I heard him fine.
Okay, then ignore me. Ben,
All right.
what did I miss in your title? What do you do? What do you consider yourself? And we will dive into the most, what's the right word? It's Monday, so my brain's a half step too slow, but being a socialist, anarchist, libertarian is not anything anyone would ever think one person can be. So would love to just dive into that in a moment with you.
Sure thing. So, to answer your question, what do I consider myself most? It's actually humanist. I'm interested in human well-being, and I think my ultimate goal is the flourishing of humankind, and that's also why I'm a Bitcoiner. As for my politics, which is the main topic here, the general term is libertarian socialist. That is actually a very broad term, though. Lots of people fall under that particular thing. Even though I know a few agorists who would disagree, agorism is generally considered a type of libertarian socialism. I would narrow it down a bit more for myself and say I'm a free market anarchist, which basically means I'm an anarchist who believes in free markets. That, however, free market anarchism does not mean the same thing as anarcho-capitalism. And that's where a lot of confusion comes in, quite simply around the definition of capitalism. So I am most definitely an anti-capitalist, but in order to understand what I mean when I say that, it kind of helps to understand what do I mean by capitalism. If you define capitalism purely as free markets, then obviously I'm not an anti-capitalist because I already said I'm in favor of free markets. I think free markets are a good thing. But I also think it's wrong to define capitalism as purely a system which has free markets. Capitalism is a system where you can control things the more capital you have. So essentially, you have some kind of structures in place, especially things like governments, which are capable of saying, okay, we're going to define this virtual capital structure, such as a corporation, and then build on top of that to allow that thing to act as if it's a person. So things like corporate personhood are a part of capitalism. These are the things which I'm against as an anti-capitalist. Essentially, that's what most classical anarchists are generally defining themselves as.
So can you just quickly iterate, because you went through a couple different decision trees, and I'm actually taking notes as we go. So libertarian socialism
Yes.
is an offshoot free market socialism, or is that all kind of the same thing?
Free market anarchism, and I'd call it a subtype.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd call it a subtype. So essentially, libertarian socialism is just this very broad thing. It's slightly less broad than socialism because you can. Let's start off at the very top level. Socialism is a system whereby the means of production, distribution, and control. The means of production, distribution, and exchange are controlled by the people as a whole, rather than by a single entity. That's pretty much the definition of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
From there, you can have either state socialism or libertarian socialism. State socialism is, for example, what the USSR tried to do. So where you have a single state who is responsible for managing all of those different aspects of socialism. Then libertarian socialism is the counter to that. That's where we say, okay, we like this idea of socialism. We like everything belonging to the people as a whole, but we don't like this idea of having a state controlling it because we believe that if you have a single state, it's going to become corrupt. Yeah, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you put everything within the control of a state, obviously they will abuse it. And we saw that in the USSR. We saw that in China. We see that in every state socialist environment. So libertarian socialism is basically the counter to that.
Okay, got it. And then how does it, anarcho? You also mentioned, sorry.
Wait, I want to. Can we
Go
go
ahead.
into anarcho in a second? Because
Yeah, absolutely.
this literally was the exact thing that triggered. I was working out in the morning, listening to your interview, and when you gave that explanation of socialism, I literally was like, "Nope, all right, we're getting him on the show because we need to hash this out a little bit." Because I don't feel personally, I don't feel like either of these definitions encapsulate what we see spoken about today. And you highlight that a little bit as well, that like somewhere along the way we kind of lost that definition and it got turned into something else. I'm curious what you attribute that shift in the definition of socialism to be, and where or why this new definition is at fault with what you believe.
I really wish I could just channel Noam Chomsky here because he described it incredibly well at one point. So I'll do my best. Basically, during the Cold War, the USSR said, "Hey, we are socialist," and the US said, "Hey, those guys are socialist." So you've immediately got this propping up of the idea that whatever the USSR does is socialist and whatever the US does is capitalist. To try and create this strong division, because, well, that's kind of the point of war. The Cold War was creating this division between the two, trying to make the godless commies on one side and the Christian capitalists on the other side. That's kind of what this whole thing was happening. And what that meant was that the USSR could start doing some things which were decidedly not socialist, but everyone in both the USSR and the US would agree is socialist, quite simply because of this ridiculous division that they had. Saying everything that happens there is socialist. So I'd say that's where some of it comes from. But then later, and especially probably in the last 20 years or so in the US, there's been a further trend towards the idea of socialism being essentially anything that the Democratic Party wants to do. Now, let me first preface this by saying I do not think the Democrats are socialist in the slightest. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans are authoritarian right-wing parties. They have different flavors of authoritarian right-wing behavior, but they're still both authoritarian. They're still both highly capitalist. It's just what kinds of companies they want to support and what kind of social policies they want to support tend to be different. One tends to be more family-oriented. The other tends to be more, handouts to the poor kind of thing, rather than economic behaviors. So I think that's where a lot of the split comes, a lot of the confusion around the term comes from. Essentially, people applying the label to something which it really isn't, but then through the actions of those people, those actions become associated with that label.
And I love how you just clump together the Democrats and the Republicans in America, because they are just cut from the same cloth. They may differ on a couple of different things. So where would you then say the US sits on this spectrum that you've described?
The US is an incredibly diverse place with an incredible diversity of people. I think there are people in the US in all corners.
No. I mean specifically like our current political system. Where is
current political system? Yeah, I'd call it highly capitalist. It's essentially it's almost a form of devolved capitalism in a way, whereby the government is taking a keen interest in individual companies and then propping them up as much as possible, and then giving them a lot of political power. And that's one of the things which is really really noticeable in capitalism, as I would define it, is that companies are given political power. They're given the power to control the people. You can even, if you look at classic science fiction, you've got the concept of this dystopian future, cyberpunk kind of dystopian futures, where governments are basically meaningless and you just have mega corporations controlling everything. That's essentially the end stage of the type of capitalism which America is currently in.
I like that you've equated some of these corporations to be sort of, for lack of a better word, like almost like a lapdog for the government, or like a stooge of the government. rather than focusing on that aspect of it, I do want to unpack some of this, like the government putting money or the government propping up businesses or industries that in a truly free market system would have just, the market itself would have dictated that this business no longer needs to exist and a new business should in turn succeed or be propped up. Like, again, how or what are you seeing from a historical context that justifies some of these decisions, if there's any justification at all? And I'm just going to blatantly and bluntly ask, like, how is that not socialistic in nature?
So it's not socialistic in nature purely because, like I said before, the definition of socialism is control of, or the means of production, distribution, and exchange are controlled by the people. The government giving handouts is not part of the definition of socialism. The government propping up companies most definitely is not, because in a purely, truly socialist society, companies as individual entities, as a separate entity to the people who are a part of that company, wouldn't really exist. They aren't, they're a legal fiction. Companies are something defined by the government. What is a company other than a piece of paper that the government has said this entity now exists? So, if you go to the proper end goal there, say, okay, if there's no government, then there cannot be companies, because you cannot have a company as a separate entity. Of course, there are still people getting together, working towards common goals, and you can use a term like company for that, but it has no extra legal status. It has no status as an entity that is separate to and something apart from the people that exist. So, I don't think companies should be able to own anything, for example. People should own things, and people can come together with the things that they own to do great things. But it shouldn't be this legal fiction created by a government of companies to make that exist.
There's a big can of worms that I know P is going to want to unlock, but I want to, okay, let me ask this then. If my tax dollars cover, I'm just going to make up a company, let's say American Airlines. And let's say American Airlines, in a period where the government has decided, or the world has decided, hey, we can't really fly like right now, probably not in the best interest of people, so no flights. But this made up company, American Airlines, planned very, very poorly for a potential catastrophe like this, and in turn has now asked the government, hey, can you save us, made up company American Airlines, and give us just some money to hold us over? Me as a citizen whose tax dollars went towards that, I feel like I have contributed to propping up this company, while at the same time I reap no rewards.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. That's not a good thing.
But in that scenario, how is that not, to a degree, the people themselves having some ownership, whether it's a positive ownership or a negative? In this instance, it's a negative ownership. We own the losses, and we are sharing in that loss as the people. So that's where, like, I agree to some extent in your definition. What I'm trying to really figure out is, how do we label these bailouts so that these bailouts never exist again? My fear, candidly, is, and I noticed this a little over the weekend with certain products and doing some research on potential guests, I feel like we're slowly starting to see new products in the Bitcoin space that are borrowing from this financial system that many of us in Bitcoin look at and say, like, we don't want this. This did not work, and it won't work. And yet, for whatever reason, a lot of the products we're creating recreate that exact thing over again. So my fear is, unfortunately, as I see that, inevitably when I'm actually old and have no hair on my head anymore, like, all of a sudden random companies will be getting bailed out, even though we're on a global Bitcoin standard. And then people like you and I will be sitting there like, wait a minute, we did this once before and it didn't work, guys. Why are we doing this again? That's my fear.
So I can only agree with you completely and say, this is going to be something which I know I'm going to lose Twitter followers for. That is called capitalism. That's the problem. That's the thing I'm against. A company being bailed out by the government is the government supporting those companies. It's the government legitimizing those companies as entities. remember, that can't happen under what I'm talking about with libertarian socialism, because the company doesn't exist as a legal entity. It's not a thing. If the people get together and want to run this thing that they're calling American Airlines, great. But if they fail, then they fail. That's just the way it is. If they succeed, then they succeed. Maybe they'll get smaller, maybe they'll get bigger, who knows? But that's individuals doing things and not this idea of a company. So I also completely agree with what you were saying about this happening in the Bitcoin space. If we do not do something about capitalism, then we could have the same problem eventually. You could get bailouts happening in the Bitcoin space. I don't really foresee that myself, but I'm somewhat of an optimist. But I'm not going to say it's not possible. It absolutely is possible, and it's something we need to be careful of. We need to avoid.
I'm going to slowly start creeping into the anarchy side of this conversation now, P. So I know you're digesting.
No, go for it. I'm just enjoying this and trying to track all the concepts in my head. I am not a particularly political animal myself, and so I'm enjoying this and I'm trying to take notes. I may have more questions as we go on about wait, what does this thing mean? But
I spent a lot of this weekend reading a book about the history of Iran and America's political relationship, and it's fascinating. And I will tell you, the straw that really broke the camel's back, I'm learning, is when the British government lost control of an Iranian oil pipeline. They went to America and said, the Iranian prime minister is secretly working with Russia and they're going to become a communist state. And that's why the US came and overthrew the prime minister in 1954. Fun little fact. Anyways, I digress. You do not have a kind word to say about capitalism. And I think there's a degree of which I enjoy. However, there's a conflicting thought that I'm always stuck with. And it's this idea that capitalism at its core breeds market competition. And competition, I believe, is very good and healthy as a whole for society. How do you see competition being recreated in a libertarian socialist economy?
So because I'm a free market anarchist, I agree. Free markets are the best way to breed competition, and competition is a good thing. I just don't think you need capitalism in order to have free markets. So that's kind of where the difference comes in. I don't think it's capitalism that breeds competition. I think it's free markets that breeds competition.
Okay, point, Ben. I did not get the point on that turn. But okay, then let's unpack your definition of capitalism, where it is essentially who holds the most capital, i.e. proof of stake. So if capitalism is proof of stake, what political system or systems would proof of work be similar to or analogous to?
So I actually I tweeted it quite a couple of years back. I actually tweeted, Bitcoin is the perfect example of libertarian socialism. Proof of work is a libertarian socialist behavior because you have the people as a whole. Anyone can join, anyone can try to mine blocks, anyone can contribute hash rate. There's no barriers to entry, no government saying you can or can't. It's completely free and open. And it's controlled by the people. So everyone who runs a node decides what their rules are. Essentially, it's Bitcoin with proof of work is libertarian socialist from my perspective.
So I want to understand a bit more about how you feel anarchy fits into this equation, because whenever I think about anarchy, I truly my mind goes to the third Christopher Nolan Batman movie where the Scarecrow is holding court and just sending whoever he wants out into the middle of the ice. Like that to me is what anarchy looks and feels like.
So I guess
do you support Scarecrow is what Q's asking.
No.
Are you Scarecrow or Joker guy?
Maybe slightly more Joker, but neither of them. So anarchy is rules without rulers. And the first part of that is still very important. There are rules in an anarchy. You just don't have rulers to set those rules. It's people coming together and deciding together what the rules should be. So in a lot of ways, you can say Bitcoin consensus algorithm is a good example of anarchy. There is nobody saying these are the rules. There are no rulers coming down and setting them. We decide them by consensus. Whether a pure anarchy can work in the real world or not, I think is still yet to be shown. It's been attempted a couple of times. Spain in the early 1900s had a period of anarchy, especially in Catalonia. Then we've got a couple of smaller examples around the world in small autonomous regions, there's always been attempts at anarchy. I don't know whether a pure anarchy can survive the long term, but I'm hopeful it could. And I tend to consider anarchy more of a goal to work towards, rather than being something to be implemented out of whole cloth. So essentially, every time you remove unnecessary rulers from a system, you have made it more anarchic, and that's a good thing. So I want to build anarchic systems inside the current systems and basically make the current systems obsolete. So there's actually a nice term from socialism about that called the withering of the state. So essentially, the state itself should just wither away as it becomes useless. Bitcoin is a great example of that. As Bitcoin grows and becomes stronger, central banks wither away. They become unimportant, pointless, useless. Whether they exist or not, nobody cares, and eventually they just disappear on their own. Other anarchic systems, potentially supported by the economic system with Bitcoin, can be used to then wither away other aspects of the state. And I'd like to see how far we can take that.
So if I'm following along correctly, it's not necessarily that you want total anarchy forever. It's rather you want the actions of an anarchy uprising in a moment, for a blip almost, to then afford and give a runway to recreate and fix whatever was broken by the leader or whoever held the power previously.
Yeah, but potentially with a removal of that power entirely, it just depends on what actually ends up happening. I mean, I think I said this on the other podcast I was on as well, on what Bitcoin did. I will not say what the future has to look like, because if I did, I would be dictating it, and I am not a dictator. I don't have all the answers. I don't know what the perfect future looks like. I know what I perceive as wrong with today's society, and that is too much hierarchical control, too many authoritarians saying this is how it has to be. So get rid of the authoritarian saying this is how it has to be in every aspect of society. That's not just governments, that's states, that's organizations, that's companies. Get rid of the authoritarians and see how far we can take that.
I think, I greatly agree with that sentiment. And if people just heard that soundbite, I don't think there would be very many Bitcoiners, Pete, correct me if I'm wrong, that would disagree with sort of that sentiment, that there's just too much power concentrated by people who want to dictate and tell everyone else what is right or wrong, because somewhere along the way they were told, they were given the right to believe that what they think is the highest level of right and wrong. P is thinking so hard because he is that level of person.
I think you're correct, Q. I don't think many people would disagree with that.
So let's talk about the world, because as we wrapped up News and Notes, we're talking about Italy going through sort of its political shift. Yeah. We're talking about Iran going through its own political revolution right now in real time. We've seen it in this country pretty much on an annual basis since 2016. Something or another happens in the political space that either the left or right uses as a rallying cry almost to get their base excited and to push forward some sort of a conversation. You have all over Europe protests going on about the rising cost of oil and gas and the impending crisis over in Ukraine and Russia. These are normal times, right? Like this is on par for what human history has said, or at least human history has said that we deal with on a regular basis.
I think yes, but it's it's interesting because we went through kind of a period of relative peace and calm for quite a few years. I'd say the first 20 to 25 years of my life, the world was very peaceful and calm. These last 15 years or 18 years have been a lot more chaotic, violent, uprisings happening all over the place, economic crises. But I really think, it does come in cycles. The world has always been a relatively chaotic place. But the chaos is perhaps more heightened this time, perhaps more brutal, because we now live in an interconnected world. In the last huge crises that happened in the world, we didn't have the internet like it is today. We didn't have a global economy like it is today. One country could go through severe economic hardships without affecting other countries. That's not the world we live in now. The world we live in now, essentially things spread out all over the place. And that's actually where I see things like Bitcoin playing a really big role in helping, because if we have one world economy, which realistically we do, we need to have one world economic system, and it better not be a centrally controlled one. So that's where Bitcoin comes in. But I think there will be more turmoil. There will be more radicalization in both directions. There will be extreme fascism happening in some parts of the world, where people get more and more controlled by dictators. There will be places where a lot more freedom opens up, and it may even be a bit chaotic for a while. That classical view of anarchy, which is kind of wrong, of people running out in the streets throwing Molotov cocktails and just being brutal and violent towards each other. We may see more of that kind of civil unrest. But I think that's all growing pains towards what is hopefully a better future.
Is there any particular, and like I didn't even mention Sri Lanka, and I'm sure I'm forgetting or missing countless other countries that are dealing with ongoing revolutions, uprisings. But I'm curious if there's one in particular that you're paying attention to, as like this could be something much larger or have a greater impact on the world than we maybe are prepared to admit at this moment in time.
So honestly, not as such. I mean, I do occasionally have concerns that the whole Russia versus the West thing could escalate by just a couple of bad decisions by people in high places. If Putin decided to fire off nukes, all of a sudden the entire world is a very, very different place. It's that just changes everything immediately. I don't think that's going to happen, but of course, that possibility does exist. Other things on a much smaller scale, which actually really interest me, are things like what's going on in northeastern Syria, in Rojava. So that's one of these autonomous zones, which is trying a libertarian socialist society. And I think if they succeed and become very self-independent, very capable of showing they can hold their own and be a peaceful internal society, because right now it's Syria, they're surrounded by war and violence and all that sort of thing, so it's hard for them to do anything. But if they succeed in that, I really do think other places in the world will look to them and say, hold on, that's something we could try too. We can try not having giant centralized government. We can try having smaller independent groups of people who come together and agree on things, rather than massive institutions which you then have some vague version of democracy happening. So I think that's something to look for, but whether or not it'll happen really depends on what goes on in the rest of the world. Again, like I said, if Putin fires nukes, the whole world is different 30 seconds later.
I still haven't set the odds on that. I know as the resident Bitcoin Magazine bookie, someone asked me to put a bet down for the potential of nukes coming out of Russia, but remains to be seen, Eric. I'll take care of that bet someday. I want to spend some time though talking just about the crisis going on in Europe. You mentioned Russia and any decision Putin possibly making. It is wintertime. for all intents and purposes, I'm seeing mountains covered in snow. So therefore summer's over. It's now winter. No such thing as fall, at least not in LA. And the crisis is drawing concern from people and citizens, calling upon their governments to actually give the citizens what they want. You bring up poor decision making by potential leaders. There have been reports coming out of Europe now that back as early as January or even the end of 2021, there were deals on the table for a full peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and none of the Western leadership actually wanted to take it. Fast forward then to March and April, and there was another deal in place. And yet again, the leaders of the West opted not to take it and instead chose to continue to fund Ukraine. I want to get a sense of where do proxy wars fit into the spectrum of just like this political spectrum that we've spent some time defining at the beginning of this interview, because this unfortunately is not the first proxy war we've seen, even this century, even this millennia. Like, we see it so often that it's become very commonplace. I want to get a sense of where this fits and how do we break that mold.
So proxy wars are authoritarian in nature because obviously the people aren't the ones calling for it. So, it is done by the government. So it's an authoritarian action. Either the authoritarian left or the authoritarian right could do proxy wars. So I don't think it's a matter of the left-right part of the spectrum. I don't think it's necessarily socialist or capitalist. It can be done under either, but it requires this state, this authoritarian control. So, moving towards the libertarian end of the scale, again, whether left or right, you're going to have less of that kind of thing happening because, it's not something the people are going to come together and agree to do. I think, it really has to do more with the authoritarian, libertarian scale on the axis rather than the left-right scale.
And as a quick refresher, the authoritarian part of the scale includes both your Nancy Pelosi's and your Mitch McConnell's. They are one and the same. Surprise, surprise. Almost as if we've been telling you this for years on end now.
Both of those I would call on the right, to be honest, though. But there are authoritarians on the left as well. So Stalin, Chairman Mao. Those are authoritarians on the left.
Ooh, I got one for
Gavin
you.
Newsom.
No, Gavin Newsom is literally just like at the bottom, not left or right, just the bottom. Ben, where does someone like, let me actually start with this one. The former prime minister of Singapore was thought by many in the West to be like this dictator, just put forward his own beliefs and values into this country and this city-state that went from being just on no one's radar to now sort of the bridge between the West and the East. But those decisions were looked at very critically. He took a very, very hard stance against drugs, even killing many drug dealers in the city-state. Where does he fit on this spectrum?
So I don't know his politics that well, so honestly I couldn't say. Definitely authoritarian, how far left or how far right, I honestly don't know. But it's actually worth pointing out that authoritarianism can get stuff done. You can be very successful with authoritarianism. An example I occasionally bring up, and people always slam me for it, is slavery. Slavery is this authoritarian thing which gets stuff done. Economically, it's really good value for money to beat some slaves and get them to do your work for you. It's the cost of upkeep of slaves is far less than the cost of upkeep of employees. So authoritarianism works. But that doesn't mean it's worth it. We have to balance. The very first thing I described myself as today was a humanist. I care about human well-being. So do I want to have significant progress through a huge amount of the population being oppressed and so on? No, I would rather have less progress for more human freedom and flourishing.
I think we just need to really hammer home the fact that you were not condoning slavery as a humanist.
Oh, very much
alluding to the fact that slavery is bad. We do not condone slavery. I need to hammer that
unless it
point
builds
home.
the pyramids, in which case all bets are off. No, just kidding.
Yeah,
Obviously,
Aliens built the
Even
pyramids.
then, the pyramids are awesome, but actually, there's potentially they weren't built with slave labor, which is cool. If they weren't built with slave labor, awesome, great. I'm really happy that the pyramids exist. If they were built with slave labor, am I allowed to swear on this show?
absolutely.
Fuck yes.
Yeah, right. So if they were built with slave labor, fuck those guys. The pyramids should not have been built.
Yeah.
Also,
absolutely.
definitely built by aliens. So, like, moot point here.
Now, here's a question for you. You said that you were a humanist.
Yeah.
What if the pyramids were built with alien slave labor? Non-human. Non-human.
So actually, yeah, I use the term humanist, but honestly, there's a few humanists or a few former humanists who are pushing back against the word humanist because it's a speciesist term. I would actually be, I'm just using the term lazily. I would say anything which has a certain level of consciousness and is capable of rational discourse and so on should be granted the same rights as a human and considered equally in that.
Okay, then I got to ask this question, Ben, but do you eat pork?
I do. I don't, and I would say so. I often actually get this question as a humanist, and I would say veganism is a moral virtue, but not a moral necessity. So if somebody says, "Hey, I'm a vegan out of ethical grounds," I'll say, "Hey, good for you. You're probably doing a good thing," but I'm not that excited to do that myself. I don't see that I have to do it. I'm not required to do it ethically. But if somebody else wants to, go for it.
Go ahead, B.
I was going to take us in a slightly different direction. So you first, Q.
No, okay. I'm good.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about sort of your political views, political ideologies, the different definitions of some of these terms. I'm really curious, you are the VP of engineering at Swan, and I'm so curious how your political beliefs and your views and the understandings that you carry throughout your life around Bitcoin affect the, if at all, the specific technological beliefs you have around Bitcoin and the stuff you're doing at Swan. So put simply, what are some of the technical areas of Bitcoin that you feel are particularly important or particularly exciting to you right now? And how do your political beliefs affect those views, if at all?
So with regards to Bitcoin specifically, and not necessarily my work at Swan, obviously the two do intersect a lot, but with regards to Bitcoin specifically, privacy tech is kind of one of the big things for me. I want to see Bitcoin become much more private, much more usable without being traced and so on. I think that's somewhat of a necessity for a good, functional, decentralized money like Bitcoin is. So privacy is kind of my number one thing. That said, I would not accept privacy improvements which remove some of the fundamental aspects of Bitcoin. So I'm not one of these people who's going to say, hey, let's implement something where we can no longer accurately measure the supply of Bitcoin because we made it so private. I would be against that quite simply because I think the fixed supply is such an important part of Bitcoin. It's a fundamental aspect of Bitcoin. So privacy, yes, but not in a way that's going to destroy what Bitcoin is. So that's, to me, one of the major things that I think my political beliefs kind of lean towards. Because you can't have a libertarian socialist society without a proper free form of money. And the more you can trace and track and control the money, the less free it is. So there's that. And with regards to my work at Swan, I take very much a servant leadership approach as VP of engineering, and that's largely based around my political views as I'm not an authoritarian. I'm not going to be standing there saying, hey, you're writing this bit of code, you're writing that bit of code, you're writing that bit of code. I'm going to say, this is the goal that we have to do collectively. Hey guys, let's figure out who's going to work on which bits, who's got the skills, how do we check each other's code, how do we make sure that what we're doing is the right thing. And then any problems come to me and I'll sort it out. That's my job, is to get problems out of everyone's way in order to get the job done. So that's how my political views influence my work.
I wonder if there's a degree of, is there in just for yourself, not on behalf of any business or work that you do, the regulatory efforts taken against Bitcoin, whether they actually follow through with some of them or not, do you even care, given the fact that like there's just the potential for, if there is a policy decision that is made that you don't like, this can fall under the guise of, hey, when we have our anarchy uprising, like this is one of the rules we're just getting rid of?
I do care as a short-term thing because it makes life objective. Policies make life objectively better or worse for people in the short term. So, I'm sure it's something we can try to get rid of in the medium to long term, but as long as it's still negatively affecting people in the short term, that is something I care about. So, if there's a policy from a government to do something that I'm against, to do something bad, then I'm going to say that's a bad policy. Again, even though I'm against authoritarians, I'm against the state. If the state does something I think is good, then I'll say, hey, that's a good thing. For once, the state actually did something good. Hooray, awesome. It doesn't happen often, or not nearly enough. So, I do take that pragmatic view. I care first and foremost about, how can we get the most benefit, the most well-being for people.
It's more about not having this friction, not making it difficult to onboard more people. What are the ways that you like to help either orange pill or onboard new users to the Bitcoin network?
So I actually have a lot of experience orange pilling people because I live on Bitcoin. I haven't had any fiat balance since 2017. I still occasionally use fiat as a medium of exchange when absolutely necessary, but I prefer to use Bitcoin directly, and I do quite a lot. I've got quite a bit of experience orange pilling people. Just recently I went to Riga for Baltic Honey Badger, and I orange pilled the taxi driver on the way from the airport to the hotel. By the time I got to the hotel, he accepted Bitcoin from me and put a sticker in his car. So he accepts Bitcoin now. So that was fun. I do that sort of thing around me a lot. And my usual method of orange pilling is to find out what people's problem is with money, and then show them how Bitcoin can fix that. So everyone has different problems. So for some people, it's going to be things like privacy. For other people, it's going to be things like inflation. That's especially a big one at the moment because everyone's suffering more from it now than they have in the past. So different people have different concerns about money, and talk to them about the right kind of thing, and that's how you orange pill them.
Okay. So let's say I'm a mid to late 20s, very handsome man with luscious hair who lives in his parents' basement, has been having a hard time saving money. What route would you take to orange pill this made up person?
So having trouble saving money would be kind of the point that I'd latch onto there, and essentially I'd probably start talking about time preference. It's easier to save little bits of money if you just cut back on a few things, kind of thing. But then you have to think, what's the value of the money I'm saving? And of course, Bitcoin is in the long term going to maintain or increase its value, purchasing power, while things like the dollar is not. So that would be my route. But it's always a discussion. It's not just that I can say a few magic words and all of a sudden somebody's like, oh yeah, I'm orange pilled now. It has to be a discussion with the person to figure out what they need, what they're interested in, how they understand the world as it is, how they understand money as it is.
I can appreciate that. Go ahead.
Again, shifting topics, can we jump back to sort of how you view a potential transition between the world we live in now and a Bitcoin standard that would fall under sort of like your ideal sort of like political framework? So I think if you could start by once again like defining like the political framework that we've been talking about and sort of like why it's important to you, and then how we might shift to that and whether that can be done peacefully, aggressively, that whole process.
So that's one of those things I have to say, I don't know exactly. I have a few sort of vague ideas, but it's something which would have to happen relatively organically. I would hope it would be largely non-violent. creating new systems that are better than the existing centralized systems in a decentralized manner. So, for example, it's one of those big ones. Right now, people either talk about you send your kids to a public school, you send them to a private school, or you homeschool them. All three of those have significant problems associated with them. People like to talk about homeschooling as this wonderful panacea, but honestly, most parents suck at being teachers. So, or they're gonna, a lot of them might, do it out of ideological grounds, and that's also a problem for the rest of society. So, you've got a wide range of ways to do this, but none of those have a good solution. Maybe, I'm not saying there is, but maybe there would be a way that we could have some kind of decentralized education system whereby we can educate people using the collective knowledge of everyone in some kind of way of getting that information into the kids' heads and helping them. And I really think the internet plays a huge part in that. Of course, we couldn't do anything like that without the internet. But that's the kind of thing. And if we do that well enough, then all of a sudden there's no need for people to pay for private schools. The public school attendance will go down and down and down and down until basically nobody's going there. We just got rid of centralized schools by doing a decentralized educational system. That's the kind of thing I mean, basically. Create new, better ways of doing things that don't have all of these centralized systems around them, and the other stuff that already exists will just kind of wither away on its own.
We've tried before, and again, I need to reiterate that none of us here are experts in the medical field whatsoever. But where I really struggle sometimes is how do we, the healthcare system in this country, in America, has its flaws. It absolutely does. Yeah. But there are also flaws in other healthcare systems across the world. Where or how do we balance these things? And I want to go back to the competition that capitalism has created a lot of breakthroughs in modern medicine, in modern Western medicine, that previously were thought to be unimaginable. There's also, however, that incentive structure baked in where it's a lot more money involved in treating rather than curing diseases. And we have that conversation happen a lot, and I will pound that drum until my last breath, which will inevitably be taken from me because of a disease that could have just been cured. Instead, I was treated for. How do we really solve the global healthcare crisis? And I don't care about labeling the political system or this. There's shades of no. Fuck all of that. Genuinely, what does a healthcare system that is actually meant to help people look like, in your opinion?
I wish
as not a medical expert.
I wish I knew. I'm also not a medical expert. I mean, I do actually have some neuropharmacological training, but I'm not a doctor. I'm not a med expert. I've never worked in that field. Again, I really don't know. I can say, I'm incredibly thankful for the modern medical advances we have. It was actually about 1 year ago today, maybe actually, about 11 months ago today, close enough to a year ago today. I was lying on an operating table with a robot operating on me, cutting out part of my kidney which had cancer on it. I'm completely cancer-free now because that robot did an incredibly good job slicing out part of my kidney. But that is amazing technology. I'm alive today. Actually, I'd probably still be alive, but I'd be dying of cancer now had that not happened. So I'm incredibly thankful all that exists, and I think competition is a great way that happened. So again, that's one of the reasons I'm really a huge advocate of free markets, because I think without the competition that comes from free markets, we wouldn't have that kind of technology. But then you get things like under the US medical system, that would have cost me my life savings and more. That would have been all of my money gone. Hopefully I would have had some kind of decent healthcare plan, but even then, you pay some extra amount on top, or a certain percentage of it, or whatever that system there is. Here in Germany, where I live, I paid I think it was €5 per night for my hospital stay, and that was literally my entire costs. And parking. So but of course, I do pay into the healthcare system. So that wasn't, if you actually think about it, I have been paying for it, and everyone else is also paying for it. What is the best system? I don't know. To me, at the moment, it looks like socialized systems tend to work better than fully privatized systems. Partially privatized systems tend to be the absolute worst, where you've got all of the inefficiencies of private systems, but none of the incentives of private systems. Those are absolutely terrible. I think France has something like that. Don't quote me on that, though. Any French people out there, I might be wrong. So I don't know what the best system is, especially because the socialized systems that seem to work really well right now are mostly government controlled, and I think that is very problematic. That leads to a lot of inefficiencies and waste and additional costs that don't need to be there. So that's a long way of saying I really don't know the answer to that, but I would love for some very clever people to come together and discuss it, and see if we can figure out a solution, because I'm not that expert to talk about that.
Yeah, honestly, if you're listening to this conversation and you're laughing that I've tried to have this conversation out with multiple guests, and you're like, I have the answer, like, please DM me. Like, you will come on this show. We will talk about it, because the world needs these answers. And I do want to very quickly, before P asks his way more on topic and on point question, to remind everyone, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe down below. On Rumble, it's right up there. Just feel free to subscribe, like, and if you're listening on any podcast, feel free to leave us a review, because that really helps us get discovered more. So, P, back to you.
Ben, do you play any instruments?
I don't. I actually I started learning piano when I was quite young, and then my music teacher at school told me that I'm technically very proficient and have no soul for music. So, and that was the worst teacher ever. A teacher telling a kid that is just, okay. That's terrible. But that is rough. I gave up playing because of that.
No.
Man. Yo, we're gonna go fight this teacher.
So I asked because Yellow has been referring to you as Gandalf the Black throughout this episode, which I find hilarious and dead accurate. And so I finally just, was like, all right, I just need to make this image. So I just want to ask, like, how perfect of you as a younger man is this image?
It's not bad. Actually, my beard was never that long. I actually kept it relatively short through most of my life because I wanted to look professional, and it's only really the last 15 years or so I've said fuck looking professional. So letting the beard grow now, but yeah.
All right, I'll appreciate it. I'll get back to it and send you the next draft.
I had a similar thought, Ben, when I entered the unemployed workforces, and I said I'll get a haircut before I start work. Little did I know that my job never required a haircut again.
Yeah, that's a good
great.
So I want to shift us back to some of the more technical aspects around Bitcoin, because you do have this incredible wealth of knowledge. What are some of the technologies that you have been that are exciting you recently? For me, federated Chaumian mints are super interesting. I really like the stuff that's being done on core Lightning with plugin architecture and sort of the liquidity ads and splicing. I'm curious, like what technical aspects of Bitcoin and the Lightning Network have got you sort of your brain on fire?
So definitely C Lightning's plugin architecture is awesome. I actually only recently reinstalled C Lightning or CLN on my node because I used to work for Lightning Labs, so I was running LND for a long time, but I figured, okay, I'm not working with them anymore. I don't have to keep running LND, so I've switched over to C Lightning, and that's it's interesting, definitely. I really like some of the potential there. I actually think some of the really interesting stuff happening is some of the less visible stuff, some of the not so deep things. So don't get me wrong, I think there's some awesome, amazing things that haven't even been thought of yet that you could do with Taproot. Having really complex branches for different options for spending. I think you actually could do some really, really cool things with Taproot, TypeScript, and just building complex trees.
Hmm.
But to me, where some of the really interesting stuff, like I said, is happening is at kind of the higher level. So, BTC Pay Server, I think, is an incredible product. They do some amazing stuff, and some of their recent things that they've announced around their plugin architecture, their new, forgot what they call it, their new API, which is basically a lot more open and free compared to their old one, which tried to emulate BitPay or whatever it was. I think the stuff happening around BTC Pay Server is really going to help merchants a lot, self-sovereign merchants, to do more than they could before. So I think that's really where I see a lot of the cool things happening, because that's where we're going to get adoption from. That's where we're actually going to get people using Bitcoin, wanting to hold Bitcoin, wanting to interact with Bitcoin, rather than some of these cool lower layer technologies. And again, don't get me wrong, I think those are awesome too. But the higher level stuff, I think, is where we can get the adoption happening.
No, that's a great point. I mean, I think we were talking about this just before you came on, but solving these like real world problems for businesses and entities for a long time. One of the largest challenges in Bitcoin and adoption, as you said, is like sort of Bitcoin having this UX problem. And there's some really, like a BTC Pay Server, which for the audience, if you don't know, Bitcoin Core is the software that you run on a Bitcoin node, which then validates blocks and allows you to participate in the network and sort of be your own bank. But then there are these sets of software that run Bitcoin Core or communicate with Bitcoin Core via RPC protocols and things like that, and allow you to do additional stuff. They sort of package it up in this really nice way that enables a lot more functionality and makes it easier for people to use. So you hear us talk about Umbrel a lot. There's Raspberry Blitz. There's all these different sort of aggregations of components. A lot of them have like a really nice user interface, so you can go through and you don't have to only know how to use a command line. You can just go through and sort of click buttons and get all this functionality added in a really secure, or varying degrees, I should say, of security. They all make different trade-offs, but BTC Pay Server is a really, really robust implementation that allows you to access, Lightning and all these different applications, many of which are built by, some of the biggest organizations in the space, in order to really easily sort of get off the ground and just be accepting Bitcoin payments and interacting with Bitcoin and Lightning and everything related to it. So, BTC Pay Server is amazing. That's a great point. What are your thoughts on some of the newer kind of directions that hardware wallets are going with an aim towards adoption? In terms of this is a very broad question, I suppose, but how do we create systems that allow people who are not, super hardcore Bitcoin, Bitcoiners to safely and easily interact with Bitcoin and hold their own keys and things like that? Obviously we have Cold Card, we have the work that that they're doing over at Spiral around this. I'm curious if you have any thoughts there. This is very vague, so please feel free to be like, reframe the question.
No, it is vague, but I can give a couple of thoughts. So, personally, I love my Cold Card. I think it's, the coolest hardware wallet by far. I just love how functional it is, how clever it is. Some of the nice little things like being able to do partially signed Bitcoin transactions on SD card very trivially. It's great, but it's not that easy to explain to a complete noob how to use it.
Absolutely.
Then there are other hardware wallets which are much easier to explain and still are pretty good. The Bitbox 02 from Shift, that's a nice little bit of hardware. It's much easier to use, but it is missing a few of the features which I would personally want in the Cold Card, for example. So there's always these trade-offs there. And then you've got things like some of these newer attempts with things like the tap signer. So essentially, having your key on NFC and being able to just tap to put one of your signatures on. I think that's a very interesting idea, but again, there could be some trade-offs, there could be some concerns there, and you need to really think about the different security models. I don't think there is any perfect security model without education. So no matter what we do, we need to be able to educate people on what they are using. And I think a lot of that needs to start quite young. So, I have 2 kids of my own, and, absolutely when it comes to things like, what is a seed phrase? How do I back it up? What happens if somebody else gets access to my seed phrase? What is multi-sig? Oh, look, multiple seed phrases. Those sort of things, those are the things I'm teaching my kids early, absolutely. Because if that is natural to them, if that's obvious to them, it doesn't have to be that complex. It's something people can intuitively understand if they've learned it in an intuitive kind of way, rather than it being this strange, arcane, complex system. I'm hoping my kids never need to open a bank account. I'd love for the world to be at the point where they don't need to do that. But if they ever do, they're probably going to find it disgustingly complex and weird and not make sense, because that's not the world that they've grown up with.
Yeah.
A little bit off topic. I have one more question, P, and then I promise I'll shut up and let you have all the technical conversations you want to have. So, Ben, last week I made a sweeping declaration on this show. I feel like for some time in the Bitcoin community, we've almost overly romanticized the idea of the next billionaire or the next mega cap company essentially adopting Bitcoin in some way, shape, or form, whether it's they hold it on their balance sheet or they are now accepting it as a form of payment, whatever it may be. We continue to be like, oh, yes, Elon Musk now holds even more Bitcoin, or Michael Saylor now has almost 1 millionth. Like, my question is there a point where we probably should not have so much Bitcoin concentrated in the hands of like a few high net worth individuals? Or did I just put a hit out on myself by repeating this so many times on the public? Just know, if I get killed, it was them that did it.
I actually think it needs to be both, because it does tend to be things like, let's say McDonald's all of a sudden worldwide started accepting Bitcoin at those payment terminals that they have. You go in, you order that stupid touchscreen thing, and then you pay. If they started accepting Bitcoin at those worldwide, that would be one company doing it. But what would that actually encourage? That would encourage broad adoption. That would encourage a whole lot of people who go to McDonald's go, oh look, what is this Bitcoin thing? I've heard a lot about this, but I've never really looked into it before. I can use it at McDonald's, interesting. And people would start getting a small amount of Bitcoin. And I think that's what's really important, is the broad adoption of Bitcoin. So it shouldn't just be in the hands of these centralized entities, the big central entities like Michael Saylor, McDonald's, whatever. But if McDonald's did that, that would encourage the broad adoption. So I actually kind of think of it as almost in some ways a necessary evil for that sort of thing to happen. But broad adoption is the goal. I just don't think it's going to happen without probably some of the larger entities deciding to accept it. Yeah.
Well said.
Ben, I want to give you the opportunity to maybe touch on anything we haven't yet asked you about, or any topics that you wanted to take this opportunity to highlight. The mic and floor is yours. No censorship whatsoever.
All right. I hadn't actually thought of anything in particular. So I think it's actually been a really good conversation so far. And I actually, one of the reasons I agreed to do this interview was I know that there is still a huge pushback against the word socialism out there. So something I would actually like to kind of say to everyone: if you think that my position is not socialist, then feel free to call me whatever you want to call me. Labels are just labels. Who cares? The reason I currently use those labels is because that's how political philosophers of the past have defined those terms. Sure, on Twitter, if you say libertarian socialist, you get 90% of the people saying that makes no sense, that's an oxymoron, that doesn't work. If you say that to a political philosopher, it makes sense. If you pick up a book, books on political philosophy, you will find libertarian socialism described, and it's the position that I hold. So that's why I use that label. But I'm not attached to labels. I don't care that much about labels. What I care about is people's beliefs and people's actions and how people behave in this world to make the world hopefully a better place rather than a worse one. If I see people making the world a worse place, I will actively work against them. If I see people making the world a better place, I will actively help them. So labels, who cares? What I care about is positions.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I will say I've learned a lot in this conversation. And one thing that I want to ask is, can you recommend any resources that, like, visually, because I'm a pretty visual person, like lay out sort of like the different aspects of this spectrum? I found a few as we're talking, but none of them really kind of like supply enough detail.
Visually, not so much. I mean, when you say visually, the only thing I can really think of is this nice little test you can do online called the political compass, and it gives you a position on a 4-axis quadrant between so 2 scales: authoritarian to libertarian on vertical, and left to right. So socialism to capitalism on the left to right axis. And you can take this test, and it gives you a point somewhere to show you where you belong. And those questions can help highlight perhaps what some of the positions actually are. I actually find it interesting because a lot of people who say that they are libertarian right actually end up on the libertarian left when they take the test. They just didn't realize it. People who are free market anarchists, for example, are most certainly in the lower left quadrant, not the lower right. But if they call themselves an anarcho-capitalist, they might have thought of themselves in being in the lower right.
Interesting.
But even though it's not visual, there's a couple of books I'd really recommend.
Please do. It's so funny you say that, because I literally am looking at a 4-quadrant chart right now, and it gets it backwards. It literally just makes the mistake that you just said.
Yeah. So Socialism by John Stuart Mill.
Okay.
That's essentially about libertarian socialism, despite the name not having it. And another book also by Mill is On Liberty. So that's obviously if you take those 2 books together, and then another kind of very short one, like this is a tiny book, is The Soul of Man Under Socialism by Oscar Wilde.
Okay. I love it.
Yeah, Oscar Wilde's awesome.
I'm going to try to read through these, or at least one of them, before we have our next conversation, so I can hopefully give you some like real meaty questions the next time we talk. I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure.
Ben, where can our audience get triggered by following you most?
So that would be Twitter. It's just my Ben _ de Waal. So first name, last name with an underscore in between.
And I want to really hammer home, if this conversation triggered you, made you uncomfortable or upset, probably worth taking the time to explore that. Probably worth taking the time to reading and listening to ideas and thoughts that you may not necessarily or naturally agree with, which I hope was part of this conversation for you all.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Well, let's call it a show. My friends, we will see you same time, same place tomorrow. Q, who do we have joining us tomorrow?
Tomorrow we have Natalie Smolensky from the Bitcoin Policy Institute joining us, as she has written a white paper on CBDCs that she will be presenting to Congress on Thursday. And we're going to break down and have a conversation with her about this white paper.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the premise of the white paper is CBDCs bad.
Yeah. You hit the head on the nail right there,
CBDC equals
man.
bullshit.
Yeah,
Cool.
I genuinely thought when it was sent to me, I was like, wait, is someone making a case for CBDCs? And am I about to have to spend the next hour and a half reading this case? And very quickly I was like, oh no, okay, cool. Based. Got it. This is going to be fun. Very well written. I'm excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Well, my friends, if you have not already, as always, Bitcoin Amsterdam is right around the corner. You can get your tickets today on the website. Use code BMLive to save 10%. Of course, as Q said earlier, we also have our incredible censorship-resistant issue, which is more and more pertinent in today's day and age. I don't know. We don't sell foam Bitcoin things in the store, so I don't know why Q's way. Oh, there it is. There's the magazine. We'll see you tomorrow, my friends.